Welcome aboard, everybody. The topic today is whatever happened to the smoke break? Strategies for secondary trauma. It promises to be an absolutely fascinating topic from two very thoughtful individuals who have a lot to say in some very interesting and perhaps even unusual directions, a little bit different from some of the discussion that many of us would have. And hi back to Old Blighty, to Wendy in the UK. Great to have everybody here. So let's get into it. We're really happy that you can make it. We know you're busy and it is a webinar format, so don't worry about trying to unmute your microphone. I don't think you could do it even if you tried. And it's just great to see everybody checking in here. So I'm going to race through some of the basics and just extend some gratitude from the outset to the folks involved at Safer Society, starting with our original founder, an amazing human being named Faye Honey Knopp, known as Honey to the folks here in Vermont. She was a Quaker who felt very, very strongly that if we were to ever end violence, social violence and sexual violence, we needed first to understand the people who were causing harm to others and then design our responses to violence around that. And so she started Safer Society in the early 1980s, I think around 1982 or so, and started publishing books and eventually workbooks. And as of today, we're a nonprofit dedicated to providing services and resources for preventive and restorative responses to sexual and social violence. This is our executive director, Mary Falcon. She's working behind the scenes to make sure that every book is balanced and every I is dotted and every T is crossed. This is Steve Zioli. His title is marketing director, but he's also been around at Safer for a very long time and houses much of our institutional memory. Generally speaking, if you're happy with some of Safer Society's products, it's probably because of the layout that he put into it. And then my partner behind the scenes is Sarah Snow Haskell, who does fantastic things with technology that I don't always completely understand, but she is on the other side of the webcam, making sure that everything is working exactly right. So thank you to all of these folks. We all together believe that knowledge grows when it's shared. So this is why we do things like free webinars and paid online trainings for CEs, producing books, and of course, a magazine as well. So coming up, I just want to let you know on August 5th, my friend Alejandro Leguizamo will be joining me to talk about manhood, masculinity, and treatment for sexual offending. And then on August 10th, we've got Fritzi Horstman, who will also be talking about her project, the Compassion Prison Project. If you've never seen her documentary called Step Inside the Circle, it's at YouTube and is really worth a look. Her understanding as a documentarian of trauma is really second to none. So it'll be a great pleasure and honor to have her on board. And of course, we've also got all kinds of online trainings coming up, everything from examining pedophilia amongst non-justice involved individuals to providing treatment who deny their behaviors, risk, needs, and responsivity in many different forms, et cetera, et cetera. So be sure to join us. It's just great to have you. This is our magazine. The most recent article was written by Alex Rodriguez on teenagers' digital sexual behavior and the team's approach to understanding, and that is also a free service to everybody. So great to see everybody. Hey, Mitch, nice to see that you could join us again. So here's the basics. Please use the chat and Q&A features towards the bottom of your screen to ask questions. The intended audience, of course, is professional. This means that there may be some degree of commentary, things that we say that are intended for other professionals who really understand what it's like to work in the field. These are not introductory conversations. So we just ask that you understand everything in the spirit in which it's intended. And of course, time is short. So comments and questions should be directly related to the topic at hand. The structures for the first half, we'll have a conversation, and then for the second half, we'll do audience questions via the chat and Q&A features. Please don't raise your hand because it ends up being more stimulation than I can handle. I can only pay attention to so many things at once. So use the chat and Q&A, and feel free to speak your mind. And then after it's all over, please do give us feedback via the survey at the end. So yeah, and I meant to skip over that part. With this, I just want to say a great big thank you to Kristin Dempsey and to Ali Hall for joining us. So with that, let's get right into it. And I'm going to stop my share. And here we are. So thank you so much. I think by now the audience will have read a little bit of your bios. I certainly know you through the motivational interviewing network of trainers. And we've had a lot of conversations together over the years about how to implement motivational interviewing and like-minded approaches. So I'll just start with you came up with one of the catchiest titles for a webinar I've ever seen. Whatever happened to the smoke break? It certainly took me back into years. What's the story with that title?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you to the Safer Society. And Kristin, it's good to see you as well. Thank you, everyone, for taking your time today. Or if you're listening by recording, thank you for taking your time to join us. Yeah, okay, so the smoke break. And this, we've certainly all seen people step away from their tasks and their workstations, maybe on their own or with others for a cigarette. And certainly workers have fought long and hard, both individually and collectively, to safeguard their breaks, exert some control over their time and their conditions, and have some autonomy. In fact, originally the 8-hour workday protests had the slogan, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. It was a very time and autonomy-based idea that even brought us the so-called 8-hour workday that we seem to have been missing for a long time. But while breaks are now protected by law and built into organizational policies, even the smoke break has some pretty fierce defenders. Over time, people are taking fewer and fewer breaks. They're doing less to separate themselves in real ways, both altogether physically, emotionally, and mentally. And they're taking less time to generate some thresholds between work and life. And in fact, have begun to integrate an organizational and cultural message that around the clock is good, always on is the way to be. We're only valuable and important if we're always on and always at the beck and call. And this has absolutely taken a toll. So Kristin and I were looking at each other, talking about secondary strain and noticing the impacts on people, particularly during the pandemic, but even before that, and noticing particularly in a social justice way that people, particularly women and particularly people of color, are overly burdened by all of this, but it's happening for everyone. And we looked at each other and said, whatever happened to the smoke break? That was something that people were pretty into. They're not even doing that so much anymore. Breaks have just gone by the wayside, and hence our title.
Yeah, and in fact, one comment that you've made, I wonder if you could speak to it, is not only is the smoke break gone, but those people who used to get together to do smoke breaks and talk during their breaks are now in the parking lot, in their cars, and doing it by themselves. Isolated, yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah. Kristin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Ali, and thank you, David, for having us. We've been putting a lot of thought into this work, and one thing I'd like to say, just to kind of add on to the whole smoke break idea, and Ali brought it up. It's like, yeah, what did happen to that? Like, I know he quit smoking, but it seems like there's something else, and it's, again, this, I call it definitely the frog in the boiling pot of water kind of thing, where it's just like over the years, it's just been work is, at least I can speak for myself and a lot of people I know, just work has just been kind of creeping, and any type of break has gone away. And I think the pandemic has really kind of shown this. All of a sudden, people are like, I'm not commuting for 3 hours and look at this time, and there's a little more, again, that idea that Allie's talking about, having control over time. And again, I think part of some of this struggle we have maybe of thinking about going back into the office is exactly that. Is like, is it going to be like that again, where I'm going to be more isolated and, gradually where, we did, not only did we not have our breaks, but we're not seeing each other. We don't have a lot of control over our time. If we do take a break, it might be, while we're checking our mail, and, and we're less community, less, more isolated. So it just is, I think it's been this gradual kind of shaving away. Allie brought up something in another talk we were doing related to this. I had totally forgot. You were talking, Allie, about having the signs at our desk, like off to lunch, be back in half an hour. Mm-hmm. I used to have signs like that. It's probably been over 20 years. I don't know if I've had a sign like that this century, but I used to have signs like that. Like, I am out for lunch and I'll be back. Yeah. I never do, I'm always on. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like there's something wrong with us if we need that time, and people don't always observe the boundary that we've set. An out of office message is accompanied often by shame. When others are on the job or working 24 hours, if we happen to be unavailable for a day, we've sort of internalized this message that we should feel bad about ourselves. And David, I think I've cut you off.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about many things. Your point about it all being shaved off is really well taken. I know, going off script a little bit, I'm married to somebody that lost her job as a result of taking maternity leave. And I watched how it happened. And what they did is they said, we're going to actually just terminate the position altogether. And they were very effective at getting around the law. But it was really clear what they were doing. They didn't want to have to deal with somebody who was raising a kid at the time. There was things to do and people to see. So they arranged it very, very well. But the message was obvious. And we don't always, I guess in some ways, corporations are getting better. I pick on corporations, I'm sure, and agencies as well. But any thoughts on that versus shaving time?
We know a couple of things. It also depends on how much power you have in the organization to some extent. It also depends a little bit on the kind of business that you have. If I'm a bit chagrined, I wish it were different, but I think the pandemic should have taught us a couple of things. That the people that we decided were essential workers are those who typically earn a lower wage, are more expendable. We demand everything out of them, and we don't view their needs as human infrastructure. I mean, we do a great job as a society of commodifying time and commodifying people and stripping away of autonomy without realizing that childbearing, child care, elder care, all of these things are, without which the economy would absolutely fail. And yet we don't see those things as important infrastructure, not as important as bridges and roads.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, maybe it's worthwhile to go back a step and say the other part of this, of the title for your presentation has to do with secondary trauma. It might make sense just to make sure we all have a clear understanding of what that actually means.
Right. Thank you, David. Yes, we've been kind of rolling around defining a lot of terms for the last couple of months doing this work, because they're out there a lot. And it's like, well, what does this stuff mean? And a lot of the definitions I have is from the work of Charles Figley. Many of you are familiar with as a kind of famous kind of traumatologist and trauma researcher. And secondary traumatic stress is a term used to describe a situation in which we're traumatized not really by experiencing a traumatic event, but by hearing about it. And hearing events that have been experienced by someone else. So any of us working in the helping profession, often hearing about other people's experiences a lot. And then we can actually, through this, have an experience of being vicariously traumatized, right? There's that piece. And then you've also probably heard of things like compassion fatigue, which is just kind of the exhaustion we can have from working with folks and again, not being in balance with that, because all of the work we do certainly can take from us, but are we kind of filling up the cup, right? Being able to keep ourselves going. And ultimately, I can maybe talk about this a little bit more. What we're trying to achieve, and again, this is some more from Figley's work, is a balance between compassion, stressors, and compassion satisfaction, with this idea of building compassion satisfaction and the things that really kind of feed us, having that be more balanced, because we're always going to have a challenging work, but how can we, be challenged in such a way that we're not burning out? And burnout is kind of a more general term. Anybody can burn out, but it's in any field, but we certainly have it a lot in the helping professions. And that's where we're just, we're tired, we're irritable, we have physical complaints, we're not doing our work as well. So it doesn't always show up as a direct link between, I'm stressed at work. It can show up in these other ways where we're just performing on all different levels, not so well. We're under stress, we've run out. The idea of a match burned out is, I think, a really kind of clear image of that in some ways.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kristin. Can I just say, though, into that, and part of the pandemic, a special effect here is that some of the things as we as helpers have had some distance from, as people are describing trauma and sharing that with us. And so the compassion that we're putting out to people in those moments, we can also walk away from a little bit if it isn't our direct experience in that moment. Yes, we're experiencing secondary trauma, and we might be able to step away or distance ourselves. One of the things that's happened in the pandemic is that the very stressors that those we're serving are telling us about may also be some of the same things we are experiencing and can't get away from. So more appointments are being requested, fewer missed appointments, more people are asking for services, the complaints are stronger and higher, and we may be experiencing also as helpers some of the very same things. So direct and secondary trauma with the blurring of roles during the pandemic. Just a thought.
Right. And there's a term they actually use for what you're describing too, Alex. That's actually called, not surprisingly, shared trauma. And again, it is hard to be doing the work that we're doing while we're all kind of in the same storm.
Yes. And in fact, I'm seeing a lot of awesome comments coming in. One that's right on point with what you're saying is, with the opioid epidemic, in addition to secondary trauma exposure, many in residential treatment, corrections, et cetera, are also experiencing direct trauma through overdoses and deaths. Something that I imagine entire teams have to go through together.
Yes, out here in San Francisco, few months ago, some of you may be familiar with this, but we actually had an article. San Francisco's been somewhat well known for doing quite well with managing COVID to some degree for a big city, but we actually had more deaths last year from opioid overdose than from COVID, right? So that's just, we're all concerned about COVID, understandably, of course, but that just goes to show we have this other, pandemic out there that is really having an impact, but is getting virtually no attention in some places.
Yeah, absolutely. Another comment that went through is the chat sometimes maintains quite a high velocity here, was also just the social isolation brought about by cell phones. As well. Something I think we rarely discuss and is absolutely true. So,
and when people are, even if they do take a break, they're switching to another computer window and answering other pressing emails, or a training break, say in a workshop, really isn't that if you're also managing these other balls up in the air.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I didn't hear in your list from compassion, fatigue, and burnout is also the idea of moral injury. That's been very much on my mind. Has that been on your radar very much? I imagine it kind of overlaps with all of these. Any thoughts, either of you?
I can certainly speak to that, Alex.
Please.
Yeah, I actually did a little training kind of around clinician self-care in the fall of last year, integrated in some aspects of moral injury, because it was coming up a lot in the work, just for us generally as people, but also as clinicians, of these places where we were just feeling so distressed, like we physically couldn't be there, like we couldn't physically be there for our families, in places where we have to do this shelter in place, and imagine this is for everybody, right? We were all having to shelter in place. And I think for clinicians sometimes, knowing that we have people who would so benefit from us being in contact, who really actually need us in contact, who don't have access to technology and such, in addition to just the work, stress of how do I work this out, there had been this sense of moral injury of like, I'm doing something I'm letting somebody down. I need to somehow, be better, even though like there are so many factors that impacted people's stress. And I remember part of this conversation came up a lot around the holidays last year, because so many clinicians who were given so much and wanted to be with family and other folks couldn't do it, couldn't be there, of course, because of the pandemic.
And I think that to not to layer yet more onto this, the idea too of the moral distress that comes from inadequate organizational responses and our inability as individuals to really fill those gaps. And finally, we're finite as well, but this idea around moral distress and finding our moral resilience, even in these moments when we can't match organizational inadequacies.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And I see another comment coming in. As a clinician working with child trauma, Department of Social Services and courts makes moral injury really challenging. These systems can really be something. So in other settings, actually, before I ask about the humble break, what are some of the biggest risk factors and protective factors with secondary trauma that you're aware of?
Because we can also speak a little bit, at an individual level, and here it's this idea too, when the Maslow burnout inventory and the developer of that inventory has been known to make an analogy that you send a healthy canary into a coal mine and the bird comes out sick. We don't blame the bird for being sick. It's the coal mine that's the issue. So the challenge, of course, is that things are being caused organizationally that are being left to solve at an individual level. And as a social justice concern, to tell people who are already the most burdened that they should just be more resilient and, do mindfulness activities and go to yoga, it feels a bit tone deaf. But I think at the same time, we also know that organizations are not always going to be there to take care of us. So I guess we can think of a couple of levels. We could think of things that organizations can do and that leaders can do and do effectively. And we can also think of things that we can take individual responsibility for. What thoughts do you have, Kristin?
Yeah, I'm absolutely behind that idea. It's both and in terms of the organization and the individual, right? There's places where both can, participate well or not so well, in places where both can take responsibility. So thinking about some thoughts that like Besser van der Kolk had around characteristics of people who adapt to trauma. So we've been talking a lot about risk factors already, but if we're talking, David, about some ways that people have been able to be more resilient, so to speak, some of the things that are really helpful is, according to him, is having a sense of personal control. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is for me as an individual worker, recognizing like what in my job, in my space, do I have control over and what I don't. And it's also the responsibility of the organization as well to be able to see like, are we giving, what kinds of control, what kinds of agency are we giving people who work for us? People have the right to bargain collectively, for instance. Do people have the right to like have their voices heard, about any aspect of policy or the kind of work we're doing, or the practices we're doing as examples. Pursuit of meaningful tasks is really important. So I think for each of us, we want to be able to think about what do we value in our work and how can we do that? But the organization, also needs to create space for that as well. Now, here's an extreme example of that, but I love this example. I don't expect everybody to do this, but Google has often had a situation where you get a certain amount of time. I can't remember if it's 10 or 20%, but it's basically you get your work done as a Google worker, and then you have like this small percentage of time that you get to work on your own stuff. Like you get to have some of your own projects. And I just love that idea about, even when you have to do some of the grindy stuff, to be able to have something that's like your passion project. And again, I know different agencies have different ways of doing that, clearly in terms of access, but that's important. Healthy lifestyle choices, again, on the individual level, but certainly organizations can help with that as well by certainly having some access to facilities or resources. And finally, it's social support, which I think we've been talking about. And like, what do I do to build my community? But then the organization can also be looking at ways to help foster, through activities or spaces or just time for communities to get together.
And if I can add a few things to that fabulous list, Kristin, that you've already developed, this idea that there's certainly some very easy and cost-effective, in fact, not costly things that organizations can do. And we often, time is money and all this. Well, yes, and rejuvenating breaks, even the very short ones, or spaces and pauses between things, actually physically inviting people to close down and self-reflect before moving on to the rest of their lives. Particularly helpful for work at home folks or people who are shuttling between more than one job. Those who are the most stressed during these times often have more than one job that they're juggling at the lowest end of the wage. People who are at the lower end of the wage scale often have the longest commutes and the most stress with commutes. So I mean, there are all these things that help people close down from one thing and then prospect for the next role that they're going to take up in life. It allows us to have thresholds, shut something down and move on to the next thing. Years ago, and as this could probably date me with respect to computer literacy, but years ago, they had this thing where you would close down a program and close down a program and close down a window and close down a window. But at the end of the day, you would have all these fragments still living in your computer, essentially detritus. And you would run a defragmentation program to clear, right? And so the defrag function is gone in our lives. When we don't have thresholds, we can't make meaning of one thing and transition to the next thing. It's not as though that we need to be compartmentalized, but we need to have self-compassion to be able to close one door, to be able to walk through another and be effective in that. Organizations can help people do that. There are apps. There's an app for that. There are ways that organizations can make that happen. It doesn't cost them anything and it gives them a lot. Organizations that don't do these things suffer really badly in the bottom line, not the least of which is that they're not compassionate and they're maybe not living with moral integrity to their people. It also costs them really, really heavily on the bottom line.
And I imagine in the evolution of a lot of corporations and various agencies, to return to your frog in the water metaphor, that many of them probably don't see the beginnings of the toxic cultures that end up with so much burnout and moral injury and compassion fatigue.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that has to do too with, depends on what kind of organization you're running. And I think for many of us who are working in healthcare, behavioral healthcare in particular, it's, we're not resourced well. I mean, it's not something that is funded in the way it probably should be. It's, we have these really kind of disengaged like systems of healthcare, and we have, incredible issues around access to healthcare. I mean, we're the only developed nation without, some sort of like large public consistent healthcare setup, and that's it's really impacting us. So impacts that all from top down, and so many agencies are really running with high productivity levels, with a sense of like having to make certain outcomes, and really don't have a lot of wiggle room. Don't have a lot of resource. And although I think organizations can still take responsibility and help people out, again, I think there's a big systemic piece here that's very, very challenging. And again, I think there's certain essential workers and communities that pick up more of that burden than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. In some of our discussions to the run-up to this, you talked about something called the humble break in a culture.
The humble brag, yes.
Oh, humble brag.
Humble brag, not the humble.
Oh, okay. Brag. I was going to say, because I think we've sort of discussed the humility of breaks, but I just
we have, and we don't have enough of them.
So, go ahead.
All right. So humble brag,
yeah.
So it used to be the more leisure you had, the better. Yeah. And you would brag about your leisure. You'd brag about all of your home improvement projects and all the difficulty you have finding a good golf course and all of these things. And that was the way to signify your status. And you say it in sort of a complainy way, but it signifies status. So the humble brag now is about how incredibly busy I am. And that means and particularly for the knowledge workers and tech workers to say, how incredibly busy I am signifies my importance and my status. And so everybody else around them wants to be part of that too. But it comes from, it's an idea, an intent of a complaint that comes across as magnifying and essentially bragging about your status. Yes, and the multitasking, how much you can multitask, how many hours you work, and oh, how awful and how terrible and how horrible. And yet is a huge signifier and becomes then the social norm to which everyone else compares themselves.
Thank you very much. And the humble brag sometimes takes the form of things like, you know, I had dinner with the president the other night, and he's just not that great of a conversationalist. It was very, yeah, this kind of thing. So I'm seeing a lot of the chats coming in. And I guess I also wonder, can you say more about the blurring of roles in all of this? We discussed this a little bit before the start of the webinar. Many of the people that are watching this work in the field of trauma and abuse. And for many of us, maintaining some kind of boundary or pristine role is really, really important. Your thoughts as outsiders?
Well, and it really does speak to the power dynamic, doesn't it? And reinforcing some of that. And it doesn't have to be as overt as physical or sexual abuse to become emotionally abusive, or to have people internalize a message of not having worth and not being enough and always having to prove oneself, or to have to say yes to unreasonable requests. And then what does that do to one's self-esteem and self-efficacy? But Kristin, what are your thoughts?
You know, I'm thinking about this too on the level of just like individual worker in some ways. And so part of what that question brings up for me, David, is in my private practice, this comes up less, although it still comes up a bit, but I've worked over 20 years in like public healthcare systems, community and county behavioral health. And I would find myself in that blurring of roles. I mean, certainly as I come from clinician to like, you know, more of a supervisorial role, and that can happen at times. You take on like team leaders, and all of a sudden there's various aspects of all these different things you're juggling. But what I found challenging, and I would work on this kind of culturally sometimes in different projects I did, was when I was working as a therapist clinician in like a treatment modality, but then there were times when I was working with, or I was working in a job where I was more involved in like the safety kind of issues, right? Where it's like more about the safety of this child, the safety, public safety, in terms of you're trying to balance the needs of the people I'm working with and to keep them, you know, well, and to help build their own safety and their own skill sets, while also thinking about the larger community and being accountable to other systems, being accountable to judges and probation and social welfare programs. And I found that to be a really challenging aspect of blurring of roles too, even though I may have a particular role. It's a lot to handle. It's a lot of expectations. And, you know, we're trying to, you know, work ultimately to help heal.
Yeah, very good. And as a part of this, I saw a comment about don't even get me started on billable hours. It's impossible, and an excellent point here. And okay, I guess Ali, something we've discussed a bit about is just motivation theory and how all of this fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we can think about, you know, we think about motivational interviewing and motivation on an individual level. When we think a little bit more organizationally and from a leadership level, theories of work motivation tell us a little bit about how companies can be more effective, or organizations can be more effective with those they serve. And it turns out that at least the reigning theory of work motivation, motivation hygiene theory, suggests that satisfaction and dissatisfaction are a bit unrelated. The things that cause satisfaction in the workplace are very different than the things that cause dissatisfaction in the workplace. And so those factors separate out a little bit. Things that lead to satisfaction in the workplace: having some autonomy, being able to assign meaning to our work, having a sense of belonging, having a sense of flexibility. Those are the things that cause us to be happy and motivated and feel good in the organization, that reduce turnover, burnout, all kinds of positive things, so that we don't feel ashamed by the burnout that we're experiencing. On the other hand, the things that if we have enough, right? After enough pay, after enough sort of safety and security and cleanliness in the office, more is not better. Once the office is clean, it doesn't need to be cleaner. Once there's coffee in the coffee pot, you don't have to have more and you don't have to have snacks. However, if you take the things away, the hygiene factors, if you diminish the hygiene factors, people become really unhappy with it, right? More coffee doesn't make you happy, but if they take the coffee out of the break room, people get really unhappy. So there are some things that organizations can do just to provide enough. Nice. But as for motivation, safety, autonomy, meaning, belonging, flexibility, respect, those people simply can't have enough of. And those create motivation in the workplace.
Nice.
Just to add to that, like those things that you listed up, Allie, were exactly the things that Dr. Vanderkolk were talking about that were characteristics of people who adapt from trauma, right? So it's these things, and motivation and trauma and being trauma informed and safe, they go together, they're linked.
Interesting. I'd always, in addition to this, I'd always heard it said that people don't quit their jobs, they quit their boss, which I think also just speaks to the relational aspects, as well as the autonomy aspects, a word that keeps coming up in this discussion. So
yeah,
I don't know.
Absolutely. Autonomy, yeah. Absolute worth, compassion. And if we treated everyone in these ways, one another, and if organizations treated each person who's part of the organization like that. But what do people do now? That's not so much. People are dispensable. I think I've read something recently about Amazon not minding the churn in their workforce, because at least when they first started out, they thought, well, we have X number of hundreds of millions of people in the United States, we'll just get some new people. And it turns out we do run out. We do run out of people, and we don't need to view people as dispensable. If we viewed people with absolute worth through that lens, through a compassionate lens, through a meaning lens, through a partnership lens, it would be a very different place.
Yeah, and those people that quit talk to each other, and
their customers too, by the way.
Yeah. Yes. Very, very true. Absolutely. I guess I'm going down my list of questions, but really what I want to know is, so how did self-care become such a solitary endeavor? How come we're not talking about it more? We talk about yoga and meditation, but we don't talk about sanghas and yoga classes or gatherings.
Yeah, well, I think that primarily comes from, so much of kind of the work efforts and the needs around work just being kind of put on like individual workers. And so in a kind of a similar way where it's like, people are responsible for, taking care of themselves at all levels. You're responsible for your job. You're responsible for completing your job, with that isolation and without allowing people to work collectively and increase that isolation decreases people's control. And I think that can fall into self-care as well, and I think it might take more effort on behalf of an organization to make space for, and maybe even to promote like collective self-care. And I think it's a great question though too, David, because I think even on the individual level, I don't know how many of us culturally are even orienting towards the idea of like collective self-care. And yet, when people do, or if we start to think about the things that we get together to do, we seem to really enjoy, like people who do have yoga classes, or who do like, you see more things like, people practicing boot camps or Tai Chi, or going to their baseball games or whatever. Like those are things that have a lot of meaning in our community, and maybe how to make that kind of more central to our lives, or make that more explicit. Like it's not just the activity. There's something so powerful about doing that activity in community.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm from the days of Christmas parties and, staff barbecues and things like this. Are you aware of any trends of really positive things that people are doing in groups?
Well, unfortunately, it depends on how many resources that the organization has, or the attention that the organization wants to bring to it. Mm-hmm. And it isn't always just the fanciest or just the 5 largest. But it's the level of, I think, the intent and the integrity and the heart set and the mindset of leadership that decides whether to do that. So it doesn't have to be the largest company, it can be a small or medium-sized one. But the idea is that to treat people with compassion, to reduce inequality or reduce inequities in pay and benefits inside of the organization, that everyone is happier and people at the top don't feel better because they got more, but they can raise everyone up. So there's more morale, more collective belongingness, more trust in others, more dependability, less turnover, all kinds of positive things happen there. But organizations are doing some pretty neat things, like instead of placing the responsibility for the individual to take the day off and put their out of office message on, a whole team takes the week off. So an individual is not shamed or thought less of because they're taking the day off or having to feel bad about that out of office message. The whole team is off. It reduces the stress on the person of engaging in a break or self-care. The whole team is off this week, and we will be back to you next week.
Nice.
And these kinds of things are turning out to be pretty helpful.
Yeah, excellent. Emma, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to add something to that too. I think this is a really important concept, and we see this, of course, different ways to kind of create this teaming at work, right, where people are having more connectivity as well as some rest together, and because it does help support each other and make it more normalized, so to speak. And I'm noticing, I'm wondering, and I'm starting to get this sense of, as people go back to work, and as there's some reluctance about going back to work, and the things that people are saying, like they want, or like, I don't want this commute. I want flexibility. I think having group activities may make it more enticing on some level to go back to work, because if I've been already feeling kind of alienated at work, and it wasn't that helpful in actually being at home, if I've had enough privilege and resources to be able to work at home well, to make it kind of more in my interest to go back and to make it more kind of, I guess, amenable. These might be really important next steps.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm noticing that Allie is answering questions as quickly as they can be, is answering questions as quickly as they can be asked. There was one question about gender differences in these behavioral reactions to overload. Allie, anything more you'd like to say about that for the folks that might not see the chat when they watch the recording?
Yeah, so it turns out that women are at least 3 times more likely to suffer the impacts, in part because of multiple responsibilities across many more roles. So burdens in one area, so burdens everywhere, all of that heaviness, but also particularly that women seem to be more attentive or attuned to distress around them, and hence more likely to experience it. It is also the case, not even to get in too much into video conferencing, but the impact of video conferencing turns out takes a bigger toll on women and people of color, because they are more attentive to the visual and verbal cues that are happening all around them. So not just the distress of one person in front of you, but trying to sort of have your finger on the pulse of the feelings and thoughts and wishes of 25 or more people who are staring at you 6 to 12 to 18 inches away from you 24 hours a day. So video conferencing in particular takes an special toll on women. There are things that organizations are doing to reduce secondary strain, particularly for women and people of color, related exactly to video conferencing. So there's a whole slew of solutions that relate to that particular environment.
That is utterly fascinating and squares with a lot of my own informal observations. Thank you. Also, just a great question from Emma. How do we encourage leaders in organizations to focus more on this and to promote the right people into leadership roles who truly care about their people? Additional thoughts?
I have some thoughts.
Yes.
I'll start with this one. I had a great honor to work with a county team out here in California that I've been working with for years. And I've been teaching motivational interviewing to their staff. And they have great leadership. And they, really provide so much to their staff in terms of, quality training and a lot of great, workforce benefits. And they invited me in to speak some about motivational interviewing for leadership in organizations, which is a way we're adapting MI to this leadership level, which is, bringing in kind of the spirit of MI, including, the compassion and willingness to collaborate and partner and be empathic and compassionate. And it was, so it was a delight to work with these leaders who were able to embrace in this attitude, because the skill sets are so similar to MI, but really it's about holding these values and these attitudes. So when we're able to kind of come into a leadership level of organization and have people start to buy into it, these are folks who will probably be promoting up from their ranks, people who have like similar attitudes, and being able to actually generate the policy, the practices that come from holding this kind of spirit. So I think that's helpful. So my answer to your question is helping leaders, not so much with like individual tasks, but with adopting a certain philosophy that then allows for all of this, kind of flexibility and compassion and awareness about what workers need.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely, Kristin. And so increasing our efficiencies and effectiveness through strategies like MI, not only for our individual practitioners, but using MI as a leadership style generally. You can either believe that it's a great thing to do and you come from the compassionate heart set and mindset, or you come from a bottom line approach and say, when people are burned out or suffering secondary strain, they visit the emergency room more often. They're more likely to turn over, more likely to have churn in our organization, less likely to be effective, more likely to take sick days. Now you can say, I would love to do this because I believe in social justice, and I believe that the compassionate workplace is the place to be. Or you could say, and guess what? We can also save ourselves a lot of money. We can also save ourselves a lot of money by for example, demonstrating partnership and ways to reduce secondary strain, walking around and asking questions. Back in the days when we used to walk around, or sending out a survey saying we have X amount of dollars we could spend on these number of projects. What are some ideas that people have? How can we work together and figure that out? This was a very MI style of partnering, evoking ideas, and involving people in the ultimate solutions that they're going to live in.
Excellent. Thank you, Ali. And, I see a question here that really, really, really hits home for me. It's excellent, from an anonymous attendee asking, is there a way you can distinguish between just feeling your own stress and the start of vicarious trauma, getting too involved beyond your capacity? How do we tease those things out in our own self-understanding?
Yeah, well, speak to that. I think I like to speak a lot about self-care as daily maintenance. And some of you might be familiar with some of the wellness recovery action planning kind of pieces around like how to set yourself up for wellness and basically relapse prevention in terms of relapsing into being unwell. And the reason I bring up RAP and just kind of this idea, it's of like, what do I do daily to help myself be well, and making sure that I'm keeping to that, but also being attentive to the places where I start to have like early signs or signs like things are not going well. Things are starting to break down. Like I'm not functioning well. I'm getting away from my self-care. I'm starting to have certain stressors. I'm starting to do things. As an example, on my plan, I know things are starting to break down. I need to step back and do more self-care when I lose my phone. It's in this order often too: phone, wallet, and keys. Like I lost them. I cannot find them anywhere, but I always know like something's out of whack. And these are things are happening earlier. So I think that might be the answer to something like when I'm starting to slide into, taking on too much stuff from people. So it's almost like, is it my own stuff? Is it their stuff? I don't always know right away, but if I can start to work into a wellness plan where I can start to be doing things on a regular basis to keep myself well, keep my head above water, and then start to notice when I'm not doing well, what's going on. I can start to get ahead of that. And then as long as I'm maintaining my wellness, then work with my community, work with my supports to kind of get some perspective of, is this me? Is this the work? And a lot of times it's both. And there might be some other adjustments that need to be made, but I can't say enough for like the kind of wellness hygiene, if you will, and being ahead of it.
Yeah. As you were speaking, Kristin, I was also thinking more on the question and the situation that many of us find ourselves in, where we have to focus so much on the outside that we don't get the chance to turn the mirror inwards. Mm-hmm. And the more I think on this question, the more important I think it really becomes, especially if I'm not sounding too loose. The connection back to what Ali was saying earlier about very often it's women and people of color who are more actually attuned to the colors and things going across their screen. And as a result, end up with more Zoom fatigue, et cetera. The more we have to focus outside, the less we get the chance inside.
That's right. That's right. Let me just add another thing too, because you were talking about earlier, David, and just I want to bring this up too, to add to this piece of like who's more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. There's a little blog post that's in your show notes, so to speak, about like younger clinicians and clinicians of color being more vulnerable, going and working in like community behavioral health settings that might be less funded, right? Because when you start off, we often start off in places that often have the least funding, that might be the most stretched and strapped. And so we're setting our workforce up to be really, impinged on really early, already just like trial by fire right at the beginning. So these skills, and I think the social awareness and the ability to, collectively work together and problem solve, I think are really important early on.
Yeah. And to Kristin's idea about that personal litmus test of when we need to take a step back and recharge when things are off, where it's the warning light is on. One thought might be, and particularly during times of disruption, we've lost some organizational rituals, but we've also lost some personal rituals of setting thresholds for ourselves, of setting aside time and so on. And one suggestion might be for each of us to figure out what one ritual do we still have as an anchor in our lives? Is that brewing our morning tea? Is that drinking a cup of coffee? And setting, or is it drinking a glass of water before we walk out the door or walking the dog? What is that ritual that still remains an anchor in our lives? And then attaching the litmus test, whatever that is, to wherever that ritual is, because we will forget if we don't do it on a regular basis. But if we attach it to some other important ritual or anchor in our lives, it becomes part of our system, where we just do that quick 30-second body scan to phone, wallet, keys. And before we head out the door, or before we get into the red light flashing type of a system. And what it says there is, this is important, I'm important, and I need to, if in an emergency, the oxygen masks fall from the device, and we need to put ours on first, and it's not a bad thing. We need to do that not only for ourselves, but to be effective with others. So just something to think about to really build that anchor more regularly into our lives.
Sure, thank you. And I'm seeing a few things that we might not be able to address, but let me just ask. One question here, another one close to my heart. How do we help apply these concepts to a 24/7 secure residential setting for youth in the legal system? Time off is hard to take, and workloads increase when days off are taken. It's very, very, very true. Many of us feel responsible for our coworkers. Thoughts?
I have something that I think I also put into the notes, and maybe this is helpful. I know it's hard when you're a 24/7 kind of facility, and again, I can't speak enough, to find ways of organizing as well, but also just this idea of like self-care as ethical practice. Like even when it feels like, oh, I can't take this off because someone else is going to be, but at some point, like we are our tools, we are our work tools, and if we don't, we're going to be dull. I mean, we literally will not be as creative. We will not be able to be as sharp as we need to be. We may even, potentially put our colleagues at risk because, again, that burnout factor. So it's a different way of focusing, maybe a different way of framing that. Like, you have an ethical obligation. So you're not just doing this for yourself, you're doing this for everybody, to take care of yourself.
Yeah, and 30 seconds of compassion for our colleagues, for ourselves, maybe having a debriefing room or some sort of quiet space that sets a threshold between one crisis and the next. Conveying messages to one another that it's okay to take a break. It's okay to take 5 minutes. Sometimes asking people if they need support doing one of their reports. people are going to turn around and support us as well. And again, leadership is going to be really, I think, really important to that picture of setting the tone of a compassionate organization.
Nice. And just a great question here. How do we recognize good role models working remotely? I will sometimes email my colleagues with suggestions and share experiences, but many people are finding email overload is yet another stressor. It's a great question. Good role models in self-care can be hard to find.
Another thought about this is, okay, you know, in one of my communities, you know, again, we're all doing this all online, right? So we're all staying in touch and even doing consultation, all these things, it's all through Zoom. And someone just started this project of just, it was a little extra time on their hand, but it's been very, you know, they enjoy doing it, where they just interviewed some of us in the community of just like kind of who you are, what kind of work do you do, what do you really love, and it was focused on all these things that that help promote resilience, like the meaningful stuff, the stuff that we really care about, and it includes things like what people do for wellness, and they just post it every now and again, and everyone else I know, we stop and read that every single week. And we love it because it's creating community in such a very simple, intentional way. And that's just like one example, because that's why we did it, because we didn't have a way of being together. And I think there's many more. And I think probably 2 or 3 months down the line, this example might start to get boring and maybe we'll find something else. But, you know, it's just being, you know, innovative and just testing the waters of putting some ideas out there. So you know, we get an opportunity to look at the different role models.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and collecting ideas even through surveys of great self-care and community care, and celebrating those who reach out with compassion to others. You know, there's another thing about celebrating that and honoring that and making that part of the culture. Even if you say everybody gets a 15-minute break 3 times a day and people are shamed for taking it, and what a conflicting message that is. But to really prize people for doing that and to protect people's right to do it. I think organizations that integrate self-reflection and increasing the number of thresholds that people pass through and do role prospection as they're working through the day are the ones that are going to be more effective now and in the future.
Nice. And I saw a comment that the NASW, National Association of Social Workers, has put self-care into their code of ethics, which I thought I'd stumbled into and then thought, I don't remember seeing that before. So it's nice to know that it is in fact something newer. Thank you, Susan. And so good role models. And another question. Do we think that certain age groups are at greater risk? I definitely have an opinion, but I don't know if it's true. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd have to do research to know like which age groups are actually at risk, because that's one thing we know about burnout is that it occurs at any point in people's careers. And it's something I'm really attuned to as a counselor educator, because I have these young clinicians come in and they can start to get a little crispy right at the very beginning. And it's, okay, we have to start building in this practice like now. And so of all my professional development classes, self-care is integrated into it. Because again, for this whole ethical purpose and also just to help them, stay alive out there.
Sure, there's compassion fatigue as well as compassion resilience, and the more opportunities we have found in our own lives to experience a disruptor and be able to bounce back and then identify for ourselves the skills and the strengths and the values that it took to make that happen. Ultimately, those things that are tested, become stronger. I would, not just a bit of a cautionary note. It is the case with most catastrophes that the people can weather the time of the sort of the crisis moment pretty successfully, and the fallout is experienced much later, almost as like, hey, that happened. The hurricane was 2 years ago. Like, why are you suffering now? Just to be really mindful and compassionate with ourselves that we may not have seen all of the fallout yet, even if let's just say in the best of all possible cases, COVID, the peak of the crisis is really over. I don't know that we've seen the whole fallout yet. And the more that we can be self-compassionate and kind to others, start now and give people some slack for quite a while. as they start to experience some of the fallout, I think it's going to do well for us.
Yeah. Well, as they say in our field, you are never more than a stone's throw away from a survivor. And people around us are suffering much more than we may realize. So with that, I see we're actually right at time, and you're getting some great feedback from the audience. I can't even keep up with all of the comments coming in. Thank you so much, folks. Any last words you'd like to say before we sign off?
Something I want to say right at the beginning is just, I appreciate being here, of course. Thank you. And I'm just aware of like Safer Society, kind of the little masthead over here. And I just really want to put out here how important it is to have like healthy clinicians and healthy workers be a part of a safer society. And we need to be kept safe too.
Yeah, very true. Allie, any last words?
I just want to give gratitude to all the wonderful practitioners and leaders who are with us today and thinking about these things. And I know that we're all making the effort to be the best that we can be in each and every moment, regardless of our stresses. And just, I hope that you continue to be kind to yourself and that you experience kindness and goodness from others that is so well deserved. And thank you for those, the great things that you do to serve those that need the most help in these days.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and very well said. So folks, we'll see you next time. And again, Allie and Kristin, thank you so much. Take good care,
David.
folks.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.